This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello and welcome to episode number 26 of Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham and Paresa Noble. Kyler and Paresa, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. Happy to be here.
Great episode planned again today. We've got a couple things to cover here today. First of all, to start the show, we're going to talk a little bit about cloud a little bit more. We talked about cloud quite a bit in our last episode, but there's some new news that Microsoft has announced regarding the cloud and Azure, so we're going to talk about that in our first segment. And then later in the show, I'm excited to have an author on the show that has written a book called Building a Digital Future. And it's a great book that was just released on Wiley Publications that covers digital transformations and the people, process, and technology side of digital transformations. So we're going to have the author of that book on the show, and we're going to talk about general digital transformation best practices, which will be a great conversation. And it's the plan is to cover some pretty broad topics as it relates to transformation. So that'll be a great discussion. And then later after that, we're going to unpack the book a little bit more. The three of us, Paresa, Kyler, and I, will talk more about the book and some of the findings from the discussion. So we'll cover that later in the show. So you definitely don't want to miss this episode. And as always, you can find us every Wednesday morning on YouTube, Apple, Google, Spotify, etc. So before we get into our guest, though, before we bring on our guest, Lipi, that wrote the book that I was talking about, there is some news that Microsoft recently announced related to the cloud. And last week, Paresa, you were on holiday, but we had a whole episode that really covered a lot of different things related to cloud. And there's new news since then, since that episode came out, that relates to Windows. So tell us what you found, or what's this headline story all about?
Yes, well, Microsoft just released a new product called Windows 365. So I'll dive into that. But their timing is on point, and it's very telling just where the world is going. Obviously, 2020 pushed a lot of people remote, and whether people are going back to the office, they're still remote. I think there's still going to be a hybrid approach to whether people are in the office or working from home. So, intro Windows 365. Microsoft just announced this a few days ago, and it's really a tool for organizations to implement so that their employees can access their cloud-based PCs from anywhere. So it's pretty much putting their PCs in the cloud and allowing them to access their computers and everything on their computers, their applications, their files from any device. So whether they have an Apple or an Android, you can access anything from a non-Windows device, as well as a Windows device, of course. And I got to say, kudos to Microsoft for bridging that gap between Android and Apple, because there is nothing more irritating than the gap between those two. I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever tried to send, family photos or any large files from an Android to an Apple device, but it doesn't work out well. So I digress. But this is pretty much something that's hitting the industry at a good time. And it sounds like they're running it off of their Azure virtual desktop. So I'm curious, Eric, what your experience has been with Azure and kind of really what the difference is, because it sounds like Azure is a tack on to existing Microsoft products that helps employees reach their applications on the cloud. Is that accurate?
Yeah, sort of. Well, first of all, I'd say that my knowledge of Azure is the difficulty in pronouncing the name. And I'm always confused, is it Azure or Azure? And we already are, I tend to go back and forth between the two, but I have no idea where that word came from. But nevertheless, that wasn't your question. Your question was, what is it? And we talked a little bit about this in last week's episode. We had Brad Feeks from Estes Group on, and he was talking about not just Azure, but just cloud in general. If someone provides a hosting platform or a third party is hosting your applications, how does that work? And what exactly is the cloud, and what are all the different components of it? And we did talk a bit about Azure, and one of the things we talked about is how Azure is really a third party hosting provider, even though now what you're talking about is sort of in the context of Microsoft products. Really, Azure is a broader platform than that. So it's something that anyone that has an application that they want to host in the cloud could use Azure to host that and use that as your mechanism to access the application and the data and all the stuff that goes with that. So in this case, though, they're talking about their own Microsoft products and providing a platform to deliver that via the cloud, via Azure. So that it sounds like they're taking their product suite and providing a way to deliver that, a different way to deliver that to customers than they have in the past, using their own Azure as a way to do that.
Right. And it sounds like the pain point with Azure is the ability to run multiple desktops through Azure being complex, whereas with Windows 365, it's designed to alleviate that complexity a little bit more. Even though, I mean, with that said, 365 is fully reliant on Azure's cloud infrastructure to operate. So it's really just kind of expanding on Azure's abilities. And I'm curious, I mean, you said Azure can be used with any technology, really, it sounds like. So with the introduction of Windows 365 and kind of taking that one step further, is that something that you're seeing many companies starting to do, or is Microsoft pioneering this push a little bit?
I think they're definitely accelerating the push. It's already been sort of percolating, and organizations are starting to warm up to the idea of the cloud. And when I say warm up to the idea of the cloud, I think everyone's open to it. Most organizations are open to it in some capacity, but I think their knowledge and adoption of cloud is somewhat limited for the time being. So most organizations we work with, for example, are focused on how do we get our applications, our enterprise applications, out of our on-prem environment into the cloud. And that could be just from buying a new ERP system that's hosted in the cloud, and that's their definition of cloud adoption. But what Microsoft is doing here is going deeper into the organization at a more fundamental level to bring core applications, desktop applications, not necessarily enterprise wide, but just individual applications that individuals would historically use on their desktop or laptop. Now it sounds like they're moving that to the cloud. So I think it's really accelerating a trend that was already starting, and I think it's been a bit superficial, the adoption of cloud, but Microsoft is really taking it down to another layer within the organization, from what I can tell.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious. I mean, it's brand new, right? They just released it. So do you think it's going to stick? Is it a tool that's needed right now?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know that it matters what I think. I think what ends up happening is the vendors just have so much leverage in this discussion. Whether you like it or not, Microsoft is clearly moving to the cloud, and at some point it'll be a discussion of, if you want to use their products, it's going to be in the cloud. So do you want to use their products or not? So I don't think it's necessarily a matter of whether or not I want it or I think it will. I think what will happen is Microsoft, just like we've seen with a lot of the enterprise vendors like Oracle and SAP and Microsoft themselves with Dynamics 365 on the ERP side, so many of those vendors are sort of forcing the shift to the cloud. So whether you like it or not, that's just sort of where they're going. And at some point, you risk being obsolete if you don't follow along. And like we're seeing with ERP systems, all the R&D dollars start to go into the cloud solutions and not so much in the on-prem. So at some point, that even if you resist the cloud and don't want to do it, at some point you're just going to sort of have to. So I think that's what'll happen. I'm not saying that's right or wrong or good or bad, but I think that's probably where they'll go, just following the lead of what other vendors have done.
Right. It sounds like, I mean, the scale's tipping. Like you said, every on-premise solution is coming out with a cloud solution. And it's the balance. I don't know if it's technically balanced right now, but it's going to slightly lean toward the cloud as we go forward. And just how things are going. So with that, even I would say it matters in a sense, just because it's following the trends, right? I mean, It's all about where is the world going, and Microsoft is filling the need before we're fully there. So
Yeah, and there's actually another layer to that. Just to add to that, there's another force at play here, which is these publicly traded companies and the investors that invest in them are in many ways demanding and rewarding for cloud adoption. And what I mean by that is cloud adoption leads to higher margin, steadier revenue in the long term. So that's what investors want. So, there's a heavy economic incentive for all these providers, including Microsoft, to move to the cloud. So again, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with the cloud model or not, whether or not that's best for you, I don't know. Unfortunately, that doesn't matter a lot because the vendors are all going that direction because that's where the money is, and the investors are pressuring them to do that. So at some point, to use your phrase, that the scale is tipping and it's going to continue to tip that direction.
right. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, right now, Microsoft is getting spurts of revenue, right? When a company decides to adopt their enterprise technology and implement, MD365, they get a big revenue push, right? But the inconsistency, I'm sure, is not optimal for investors and for, the bottom line of Microsoft. So this is, I think, going to be a monthly, almost like a subscription base from what it sounded like. And that's really what my experience, at least, has been with the cloud. Any cloud solution that I've used has been a month to month subscription, or you pay the annual fee. So is that how all cloud solutions are? Is it all just a month to month type of, subscribe to our platform?
Yeah, either month to month or more commonly it's quarterly or annually, like you said. But you have a really good point though, which is that it's that you're sort of locked in at that point. I mean, you can always cancel at some point, but it becomes in some ways more difficult to cancel when you're dependent on a cloud provider. So another reason why the scale is tipping that way, because the money's there, it increases the difficulty of switching platforms, and so the vendors are going to lock you in a little bit better than they would in an on-premise model. So that's just another force or another layer in this whole thing.
Right. Interesting stuff. And I know last week you guys talked a lot about the cloud, so forgive me if I'm being redundant.
No,
But
the
as
cloud
far
is
as
large. It's a large cloud, so lots to cover in there. What
it
is the
is
cloud a
large.
greater risk for cybersecurity? Just out of
That's a
curiosity,
question.
as this desktop model seems to be like there's additional access or risks when it comes to data storage or anything like that.
Well, it's I think it's more of a perceived risk. I mean, I guess on one hand you have the fact that Microsoft is going to be a much bigger target, and there's probably a lot more attempts to hack or to compromise Microsoft than there is to compromise, for example, Third Stage Consulting. A smaller company that isn't on the radar or the scale of Microsoft. So, or anyone listening that works for a smaller mid-market company, chances are you're not as much of a target as Microsoft is. So on that side of it, you'd think, okay, well there's a risk there, right? But on the other hand, Microsoft has where did I see it? I can't remember if we talked about it in last week's episode or if I read it somewhere, but I want to say it's Microsoft has several hundred, if not over 1,000 people where all they do is work on cybersecurity. That's all they are responsible for, is locking down the cybersecurity. And I think there's a number 900 that stands out. I think that was the number I saw, was 900 employees. But regardless of what the real number is, it's a lot of people. It's probably a lot more than most people listening have in their IT departments total, let alone just focus on cybersecurity. So you figure world-class cybersecurity and being on the cutting edge of knowing where the threats are and being able to protect against it, chances are that Microsoft is going to be, or any larger cloud provider is going to be on the forefront of that. So it's sort of a counterbalance there. On one hand, yes, they're a bigger target, but on the other hand, they have the resources and the competencies, presumably, to make sure that doesn't happen. And they have a lot more to lose too. A hosting provider has a lot more to lose if they do experience a breach. That's their entire business model at risk. So, whereas a mom and pop shop that gets hacked, yeah, that's a terrible thing. You don't want it to happen, but life can go on in that case. But in many cases, that can be crippling or devastating to a cloud provider. So not to say the risk is zero, because as we're seeing in recent months and years, and we've talked about it on this podcast in the past, there's a lot of cybersecurity breaches and pretty large scale ones. So it's not to say the risk is zero, but if you've got to mitigate the risk or figure out where your lowest risk is, chances are you're probably in better hands with a hosting provider that does this for a living, and that's their focus.
That's a good point, because you're kind of letting up the control on cybersecurity a little bit, I feel like, when you migrate to the cloud, because you're dependent on what the hosting provider is doing for you rather than being able to control it yourself. And in most cases, it's probably good because, like you said, having 900 people make sure that your data is secure versus, just your team of like 5 people. If you're a smaller company, you're probably in better hands that way. So that makes sense.
Yeah. What about now? Did you, in this article or the stuff you read about this, Paresa, was there any mention of the international aspect of, certain governments or certain countries won't allow data or applications to be hosted, outside their countries, or they won't allow it to be hosted in certain countries? Is that a consideration, or was that anything you saw in your discussions here or your research?
No, I did not find that. But are you seeing that? Is there, differing regulations depending on where you're based out of?
Well, I'm just thinking like, for example, in the United States where we're based, where our headquarters are, if you're a government contractor or you're part of the federal government, you can't have data and applications hosted in certain countries. In fact, I know, like, for example, China, you can't have your applications or data hosted in China. I think you actually have to have, if I remember correctly, you actually have to have the data and applications hosted in the U.S., which here in this case study that we're talking about with Microsoft, that's a moot point because Microsoft is based in the United States. So presumably, they're going to have plenty of cloud hosting options here in the U.S. But I'm just wondering, like in other countries, if they have similar limitations, if that requires Microsoft to have hosting facilities in every country, or I'm just curious more than anything how that would play out internationally, depending on local regulations. So
yeah, that's a good question. Maybe something we can look into and circle back on the next episode, because I'd be curious to see that. I mean, I imagine Microsoft is, if they're an international company, so I'm sure they're pretty scattered as is with where their offices are. So I wonder if that would help alleviate it, and if they had some strategic approach to picking, where to open up offices. But who knows?
Yeah. If anyone's listening that works for Microsoft or knows the answer to that, we'd love to hear your comments below. So good deal. Great. Well, good. Well, thanks for that overview. That was a good, interesting discussion, and just further proof that, the vendors are moving pretty aggressively and quickly to the cloud. So that's an interesting model. I'll be curious to see how that plays out for Microsoft. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to have Lipi Sarkar. Sorry, I forgot how to pronounce her last name. Lipi Sarkar, who is the author of a book called Building a Digital Future. She's going to be on right after a break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Give me the sense to wonder if I'm free.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa and Kyler, and excited for our next guest on the show today. It is the author of a book called Building a Digital Future. I have a copy right here, and this is a really good book that I haven't read the whole thing yet, but the parts I've read are very good. And what I like about it, and just looking through the parts I've read and looking at the table of contents and the different chapters in here, is that the book it covers a lot of a broad perspective, all the different types of digital transformation. It covers the people, process, and technology pieces of it. And even though the book is, the subtitle is a transformational blueprint for innovating with Microsoft D365, So it's very targeted to Microsoft customers. Speaking of Microsoft, we just talked about them in the previous segment. But however, the title is a bit misleading in my opinion, because I think this book actually applies to any sort of ERP or digital transformation. There's some Microsoft specific speak in the book, but if you kind of look past some of the nomenclature differences of Microsoft versus other ERP systems, the general concepts are relevant to any sort of transformation. So I'm excited to have Lipi Sarkar on the show. Lipi, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure, Eric, to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Glad to have you here. So maybe just also to get started, tell us a little bit about your background. What do you do? How'd you grow up in the world of digital transformation and in Microsoft Dynamics? Tell us about yourself.
Sure. I have been in the industry for the last 20 years and have been working with different kinds of technologies. So recently, for the last 10 to 15 years, I would say, I have really stick to Dynamics world. It's because Dynamics cater their applications for different kind of industries. So hence, I was working as program director and head of practice of one of the big four, and also now currently working in the consulting world. So predominantly, it's mostly on the consulting side of the world. And as you know, in the consulting, you get to work in different industries and sectors, which is brilliant. But at the same time, you can come across a different kind of technologies. And while working with that, digital transformation just evolved. It's about the technology. It's about how you manage the change. So kind of starting from the beginning towards the end. So hence digital transformation.
Right. Great. So I guess to start, what inspired you to write this book? What was it you were trying to accomplish? What motivated you? How'd you get started?
So Vinny and I came together, and Vinny and I both had different kind of wear different hats in terms of our experience. So when we were talking about the digital transformation, we wanted to write a book from our experience and leading through, different kind of implementation, different change aspects that we have gone through, and also combined with the fact that we can bring in different kind of industry leaders into, to contribute in terms of their experiences. So that's where it started. We wanted to give back to the community. We wanted to, share our experiences. And if we can just, as it happens, if you strike a chord with someone, somebody has gone through similar kind of problems, then sharing it, and we can save somebody some time in terms of, running their own digital transformation. So hence the passion started from there. And it kind of grew into the fact that we tried to interview lots of different industry and sectors to gather their experiences, their challenges, and put together in the book.
Great. So it wasn't just necessarily just your ideas or Vinny's ideas. You were also kind of compiling the feedback from other executives or other team members that had been through transformations in the past.
Absolutely. Living by the principle, as we say in the change, you have to have a feedback loop. So we tried to start with the book itself. We wrote the book and then we put that in the community, because there are lots of different industry leaders who are actually leaving that journey. So not just me, I have done many implementation. So did Vinny, but we wanted to gather the experiences and perception. We are based in UK, but we wanted to gather the experiences across the world. So, and it's a culture change basically. So we wanted to gather all the perspectives and put that into the book.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's pretty cool. So it goes well beyond even just your own experience. It's looking at others' experiences as well, which is great. So you sort of answered this question a bit in what you just said, but in general, in addition to interviewing these other peers throughout the world and other people that had been through this sort of transformation, but how did you identify what you consider the best practices or the lessons that you shared? I mean, was it based on just the most common patterns or themes you saw, or was there some sort of science to it, or was it just more a gathering of qualitative data that you sort of distilled down into the findings you have in the book?
It's a great question. And in terms of best practices, obviously, it depends on which country you are leading and which country you're having the digital transformation. So we try to include that perspective to say that if you have, like, even within the team, now it is not, and with, with pandemic, you are working with team across the different countries. So you have to take that culture aspect. You have to understand people. So that is one element that we have taken. And in terms of best practices, I have been into the industry for a certain amount of time. So based on the experiences that I have gathered, and also combined with the fact that what are the normal pitfalls that you have to come across. That's a gotcha. So what you would take into consideration while you start from the digital transformation from day one, or even before day one, because you have to prepare your organization, you have to prepare your team, you have to identify where the key drivers are for the change and what are the benefits that you're delivering. So all this combined together. So I would say yes. So it's a qualitative data. It's a perception based on different industry thought leaders. And while reading through the book, you would find the natural, ways of the key nuggets that are takeaways from the book. So hence combined all those, implemented it together.
Right, right. So as you're doing this research and as you were talking to other transformation teams and trying to gather their lessons and best practices, and you're combining it with your own knowledge and understanding, were there any, what were some of the findings that you found most interesting, or what did you learn along the way as you were writing this book that maybe you didn't already know?
So one of the things is that people have a different perspective about change. So that's kind of given. We wanted to expand into a little bit more. I've written a chapter on the chapter 4 covers a lot about a different kind of areas that you need to focus on. One is the strategic shift, where you identify the key drivers. Then you have to focus on the culture shift, where you always say that the culture, and this is a famous term coined by Peter Drucker, culture is strategy on breakfast. So we wanted to break it down further and also bring in the experiences of Potter from the academic perspective, and also implement that from the strategic view and executing those changes. So what are the key elements that comes across? So the best finding, I would say, the change element, and also when we start the journey, the benefits realization, that is one of the key factors that is always in the business case. But whether we are tracking the benefit realization, that's another key thing that we need to focus on, and we need to get better at. Whether you are doing the digital transformation with the people, along with the people, but we have to get moderate about understanding measuring the business benefits, really.
Right.
And so that is a key finding. I find it quite often mistaken, or quite often forgotten, or not even polished or updated. So we have to have that feedback loop continuously to fill that gap, really.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm always fascinated by how many organizations will spend so much time and money and heartburn on these transformations to get to go live, but then they don't spend that little bit of extra time to sort of optimize and fine tune and get the value out of the implementation. Why is that? Why do you think that so many organizations miss out on the benefits realization side, as well as the organizational change or the human side that you talked about?
From the findings, I would say there are often, when we start the program, there are often a focus around to what exactly we are targeting, what we are focusing on. There is a lot of energy while we are starting, but during the rigor of the governance, and during the rigor of regular hitting the milestone, it is forgotten about the benefits that we need to track towards the end, and how much of time it's going to take, preparing the organization, preparing the time, because most of the time its energy is mostly focused around go live, and also hitting the plan, hitting the milestone. And the reason it is forgotten, it's also about the people and technology. People might be, very busy with those kind of key activities, which is having major milestone-driven activities. So yeah, from my perspective, I would say it's a people-driven, something we need to do around the culture and the people mindset. That is something to be in the agenda. Maybe it's not in the agenda currently at this point in time. Every time we talk about digital transformation, it's mostly 3 things that comes into play. It's about what is a plan, how you're delivering, when you're delivering, and also about the change element. And some aspect is also about when it is going live, what is the support model looks like. I think the projects finish because the digital transformation is seen as a project in certain cases and seen as a program, so start to finish. But the benefit realization and tracking the business is mostly falls under the business element. It's not about who is delivering or the delivery partner. So it depends on the organization who are tracking, or the team who are tracking the benefits.
Right, right. It seems like, with clients we're involved with, it seems like a lot of times you have, to your point, you have all this focus on milestones and delivery, and there's so much pressure, and then you get to the go live, and I think everyone just sort of sighs a breath of relief. that they finally cross the finish line and they just want to go back to their day jobs, to their real jobs and sort of not forget about the project, but just move on. And they don't stay that extra time to really fine tune it. And then on the change management side, it also seems like the change management is the one thing you can't see or touch or feel in an implementation like this. You can see the software, you can see if it's broken or not working, you can see the data, you can see even the business processes, you can visualize it. But the human part is just so hard for people to grasp or understand. Did you come across any findings or lessons of people that maybe handled change management better than others and what they saw differently or how they recognized the need for change management versus organizations that maybe didn't recognize that need?
This is a vast subject. I mean, obviously, change is such a big element. Sometimes it is often mistaken, and sometimes it is often not given the consideration that it should have. If it is a large organization, then change is obviously taken into consideration. If it is a small and medium-sized implementation or digital transformation, then it's mostly about saving the cost. So hence, there is a balance of which we need to strike, bringing the change in, even if it is a small or medium. And then whoever is delivering the change in aspect of, after the project has been delivered, it's also about the governance, how we are playing the governance. Is the closing the project is not about going live, setting on all the support model, and then close the project, learn the program, learn the benefits, learn the lessons learned, and all of those kind of governance things that we talk about, and then finishes the project. But if you have to really track the benefits, then you have to have that kind of project live for at least for 3 months or 6 months. But sometimes we are taken into consideration that the project lifetime, what is the project lifetime that we have to decide, whether it starts from the beginning and finishes when the project go live or after 1 month of go live, or does it still stay current in terms of, mobilizing a small amount of team to focus on the fact that how they are tracking what is the key benefits that they are measuring after it has gone live. Otherwise, the user adoption will never kick in, even after 1 year of the project gone live.
Right. Now, that's interesting. And by the way, for those of you watching live on LinkedIn, we have a decent turnout here on LinkedIn. Feel free to drop questions that you have for Lipi. The good news is this is such a broad topic. Your book covers so much ground. We can really talk about anything we want as it relates to digital transformation, whether it's
absolutely
the human side, like we're talking about now. We can get into technology, we can get into processes, program management, strategy, whatever the case may be. And by the way, just so you know, Lipi, we have a pretty global audience here today. Just a sampling of some of the locations of some of the people listening here. Obviously, London and UK, we have a couple people from there, Egypt, Belgium, Saudi Arabia. And so we've got a pretty global audience here today. And I suspect there's probably some people in the United States as well, given the time of day here. So feel free to drop questions in the comment box on whatever platform you're watching this on, and we'd love to get those questions. So just back to my list here, and I'll keep going until we get some questions here from the audience. But if you had to summarize, maybe you've already alluded to some of this, but if you had to summarize some of the keys to transformation success, what would you say are sort of the top 3 or 5 things that teams really need to get right if they're going to be successful in this sort of a project?
First, to start with, get your drivers of change correctly, because you need to identify what are the change drivers, why you need to move from A to B. It can depend on, with pandemic, there might be a number of other factors. It's either to be disrupted or to be disrupted, you have to have a plan already. And then once you have identified the change drivers, then where do you want to be, whether it's a short term, medium term, or long term. Then once you have identified the change, once you have decided where you want to go with, have that sponsorship from leadership team. I think that is also sometimes it's forgotten, whether it's a bottom up approach or whether it's a top down. So there is, again, need to have a balance between, it has to be top down because some of the sponsorship need to be there, and also need to bottom up because we need to hear about how the change is impacting the business. So we need to have that feedback loop ready, and we have to often go through that feedback process. And if we need to change the plan, if we need to, understand where things are moving, we have to have that leeway to move around. That is one of the key things. We have tried to explain that in the first part of the book about defining the digital transformation. Sometimes it's mistaken about what it is not. Like it's not a project, as I keep on saying, that digital transformation has to be, thought through from including the people, process, and technology. Then the next element is about the often mistake that we have seen, like people try to do, an organization try to build everything. If it is decided about a 1 year digital transformation program, people try to bring all the changes in 1 year of the program. And what happens with that is that people get, and the benefit, the organization get change fatigued. So again, there's supposed to be there need to be some kind of balance in between bringing in all kind of changes that we are bringing in 1 year program. And we have to build a continuous improvement towards after we have gone live, after we have delivered one element of the project, even if it is a very bare minimum. People, organization, teams, and everyone need to get used to the system. So once they have got there, I think the user adoption can kick in very high. But without that, the user adoption is really impacted.
Right. And then maybe I'll ask you the flip side of that, and maybe your response is similar or maybe it's different, but what do you see as the key reasons why transformations fail? Of the teams that you talk to that either struggled considerably or maybe they just completely failed in their implementations. What are some of the key reasons why, or the most common reasons why that is in your findings?
I think it's a fear of change. Sometimes it's not well perceived as a change curve. You would have to have that employees and workforce working towards the transformation. At the beginning, obviously, if the vision and the communication is not very clear, it's not very clear about what we are going to do. And then the fear can, it often jeopardizes the transformation program. So from why it fails is also the other factors could be related to change. The change has not been properly perceived through and has not been properly delivered. Often it's also about the processes. How many processes are we trying to streamline? Are we trying to streamline the processes, or are we trying to bring all the features and benefits together and try to amalgamate that in year one program? So it has to be a balance between everything, and the work. We are also try to take the balance in terms of identify the key strengths and capabilities within the organization. You might be having the workforce who are perfectly capable of delivering certain areas. They have got the knowledge and experience about the processes. So involving them from day one, keeping that up to date, keeping that up to, with all the details and where the things are moving. Right.
Gotcha.
Okay. I don't know whether that's the same experience you have, Eric, but that's a finding, I think, from our book.
Yeah, it's similar. Those are some good ones. The problem is that there's so many different reasons why companies fail, but the good news, bad news is that usually those patterns are predictable, even though it's a lot of things that can contribute to failure. But a lot of times it seems like this ties into some of what you're talking about. A lot of times I found that it's misalignment. If you as a team, for example, a lot of the things you just described, do we want incremental improvements to our processes? Are we looking to improve processes? Are we trying to build in best practices from the software? That, for example, is a significant decision that significantly affects your strategy and your plan. But if you as a team are not aligned on what that direction is, that creates sort of a tension in the project, and that Absolutely. It creates a lot of headwinds that are very hard to overcome. Yeah. So I think a lot of it.
I've seen the other thing I would like to say, which I missed out earlier. People try to bring in their own knowledge, what they have worked with previously. And if we don't set the guiding principles from the very beginning, then there is often misalignment in terms of people bringing their own experiences of what they have worked with.
Yeah. Okay, great discussion. Thanks, Lipi. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more discussion. I'm going to ask you some more questions about your book. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Lipi Sarkar, the author of Building a Digital Future, and want to jump back into some more questions I have for you. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times too, we'll tell clients that even if you don't have a perfect answer, even if you don't have a perfect strategy, and even if there are significant flaws in your strategy, if you're at least aligned as a team and you're going the same direction, then that's oftentimes more powerful than getting a perfect strategy in place but not being able to execute it. Because it seems like a lot of organizations.
Absolutely, and strategy is a need to be like thought through over the period of time, and it has to be an iterative approach in terms of talking about, even if it is very sensitive risk or issues, the team should be empowered and open to talk about those kinds of sensitive risk and issues.
Right, absolutely. So we're starting to get some questions here on LinkedIn. So I'll pull a couple here as we're talking. So this question is from Marcus. I'm not sure where Marcus is. It's Marcus Clay. He asks, what are the symptoms that a company needs to look out for the leaders to look at digital transformation as a possible solution? So I guess the question is more, how do you know if it's time, or what symptoms in your business should you look for to determine whether or not you should even consider a digital transformation?
That's a great question, Marcus. Thank you for your question. The symptoms, I think, if the digital transformation, firstly, we need to identify if there is a basic reason of change. If we have not identified what are the key drivers of change, if people often get, the digital transformation roadmap might not be set correctly. So first, you need to identify the key drivers of change. And then the leadership team, whether they have got any experience of digital transformation they have done earlier, or, depending on any technology, but the digital transformation comes with, the bringing everything together, and have that sponsorship within leadership team. Without the sponsorship and leadership team, it becomes very difficult because change is enormous. Depending on the size of the organization, it could be enormous and complex. So how do you break out that complexity? So you have to have that kind of leadership sponsorship. And then the next thing is also about the symptoms of what is the culture within your organization. You need to think about the culture within the organization, whether it's an open culture, whether you talk about any kind of sensitive things. If it is not, then you might have to bring in some expertise and people who can actually look into it, because you have to have that feedback loop always coming through, because you are doing the change to the people, but with the people and for the people. So you have to have that balance balance act really to get there.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
That would be the top one, but there are enormous and different kind of symptoms. Always have to keep a check about whether people are doing fine, with empathy and listening to the people who are being regularly on the forefront of delivering the change.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like getting an organization ready for transformation. Let's just say you have some people within the organization that are leading the charge, that recognize the need or the opportunity to go through a digital transformation, but the rest of the organization's not on board with that yet. It's almost like you have to start a spark somehow. You spark a fire, and you've got to spread that urgency and spread that recognized need, rather than just sort of forcing a digital transformation and saying, okay, we're going to go pick us new software and a system integrator, and we're just going to start implementing it, and then we'll worry about change management later. A lot of times you have to focus more, ahead of time, trying to build that alignment and focus and momentum behind the purpose and the need for transformation. If you spend more time doing that, then you build up that momentum. Then by the time you get into actually selecting and implementing software, then it becomes a little bit easier. It's not easy, but it's easier than if you didn't do that.
Absolutely. And it is never going to be easy, but you can talk about those kind of problems and challenges openly and try to mitigate them. Even if there is no solution, at least you know that there is no solution and you have discussed about it, and you might have to park those items for later, for future. But at least it encourages and empowers the employee and the team to talk about that kind of things openly.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. How about this? This is from Steve from Australia, either Australia or New Zealand. I'm not sure which one. He says both on his profile here. But how important is change management with getting all the right stakeholders on board with the various projects? So perhaps if there's competing priorities or other, day-to-day business or operational needs, how does change management enable getting those stakeholders on board?
Change management should be communicating with everyone, really, to start with, to communicate with the vision and the mission and also about the roadmap. And it is a continuous communication that need to happen because there is some kind of dependency which might be related to some other project or some other team or some other, the workforce that you're working with. So hence change management need to be involved with all the business, even if it is, we can assume that even if it is not impacting directly on one particular business, but it's worth having that conversation to let them know that this is coming. And in future, if they have to, they might be aware of things. So if there is any kind of impediment or issues or there is a dependency, there is a direct line to feed in.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Let's see. So we have a question here on Crowdcast. Actually, I'll shift gears here and go to Crowdcast. And that question is, this is from Brad. And his question is, to what degree, and actually this is our guest from last week's live stream, by the way, that's asking this question. So Brad, I hope you don't mind that I'm calling you out. But his question is, to what degree does the leadership style of the organization impact the culture of the organization as it relates to change management? Can changes in leadership style produce positive cultural changes that will better support digital transformation?
Absolutely. So it is, as I was referring to earlier, so digital transformation, we need some sponsorship from the top C-suite level executives. And if the culture of leadership team is quite close culture, then you might not be encouraged to talk about any kind of sensitive risk or issues. But if there is a culture, quite an open culture, then you would be encouraged to talk about those risks and issues impacting on the business or impacting on the digital transformation roadmap. And you might find any mitigation, you might find a solution to it. Without the sponsorship, it can be very difficult, to come up and it is very difficult to assume that it is not going to be complex, even if it is for medium or small organization. I have seen digital transformation where even you get the resistance, but you have to break the resistance. You need to win those people in so that they know what benefit are you delivering for them. So even if it is like very simple kind of benefit, but they need to know what benefit you're delivering for them. So it's really encouraging to have that leadership team on board, and you have that direct link and direct communication, having that conversation going regularly.
Yeah. And
does that answer your question, Brad?
Yeah, he'll have to let us know if we didn't, or if maybe as a follow-up, or anyone else has a follow-up question to build on that. It seems like there's also the dynamic of how, we talk about culture and leadership style and how leadership affects culture. That was sort of the part of the question. But it also seems like people don't often recognize how technology can impact impact the culture as well. So, for example, because you focus on Microsoft Dynamics 365, for example, flexible product. There's a lot of flexibility to it when you compare it to like an SAP or some of the other systems in the market. So how does that, the technology itself, how have you seen technology infuse changes to the culture, and what should we be mindful of as we're navigating those changes?
That's really a great question, Eric, because yes, and hence we have written the book on Dynamics, because I have seen particularly the Dynamics has got the capabilities built around the different kind of industries and sectors. And within Microsoft, you have got those kind of tools which help the transparency and which helps build an open culture. Now, in terms of other technology, you can use the similar kind of tools, like DevOps is one of the tools where you empower and encourage other people to take decisions and have that transparency going on. But with other technology, where it is like you have to have lots of customization that need to be built in, versus where the Dynamics 365 comes with a full suite of things where you need minimum configuration and minimum customization, but can deliver the best efficiency for your organization or optimization for the organization. I think over the period of time, if we take for other technology, I've worked with SAP, I've worked with Oracle in past, but if we take those kind of technology, I think it's also enormous amount of customization that need to be built in, and it increases the complexity within the build, within the technology, and also the stakeholders, because you have to always everyone need to be on top of what is going on, and after a certain period of time, might be the business has changed, or there might be a need of something completely different, which means like you have to throw away those customization and build something new. And it can grow the complexity around that. So yes, so the technology also plays a part, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And just more of a comment here that builds on a comment you made earlier, Lippy. This is from Sudhakar, and he says, "Hi, Eric. I feel the team as a whole mostly doesn't go toward one particular point or goal. That's the problem in tech projects." And it sort of gets back to that whole concept of alignment and plan and strategy. Yeah. Okay, we have more people joining us from Australia, India, Zambia, Montreal, Canada, United States, Saudi Arabia. So we have a lot of new attendees joining from throughout the world. So here's maybe a comment that I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, Lippy. And this is from Praveen, and he says, more than communication, it needs implementation, even if you need to make some tough decisions to make the change viable. So let me rephrase that or see if I can make sure I understand. More than communication, you need to implement well. Let's try that. You need to implement well, even if you need to make some tough decisions to make the changes viable. So what are some of those maybe, tough, in addition to communicating the changes, what are some of those tough decisions that need to be made, or what are some examples of tough decisions that you've seen organizations have to make as part of their
Absolutely, yeah. So tough decision need to be made. The communication is part of ensuring that the tough decisions have been discussed or taken or communicated. So tough decision could be related to how many people are going to be the future proof of the impact assessment of people, because it will be new ways of working. How many people are really catered for? Taking that decision or being in that journey, because if you see the resistance, if people are not accepting about the new ways of working, that might be a challenging situation to deliver, or being in that whole journey. So the decision will be related to the fact that redeployment of the existing workforce, you definitely want to take the workforce along with you. If they somehow lose interest or not getting adoption, not getting the user adoption, or not seeing still some challenges, you can openly discuss about the challenges, but there might be still some challenges that you cannot reach or you cannot mitigate. Then the tough decision need to be made around the people. The tough decision is also around the processes, because there is often seen that people try to provide the requirements in the form of what they have done in the old world. Because there are so many workarounds, it is not about the best practice or the efficiency. It's also about people get used to the ways of how they are working currently. So you need to make a tough decision and challenge those requirements always, to say that this is whichever product you're using. So if you have a best practice around that particular product, you have to challenge the requirement and make some tough decisions around it. Then you have to make tough decisions around the governance also, which is ongoing, which is about teams, which is about processes, which is about the technology, because you cannot go on customizing the whole product and build it completely a new, different product. So you have to go with the product, and hence Dynamics comes in a really good way, because you don't have to do, and it is governed, because if you have to stay current with the product, it's better to have less customization, and also with the managed customization, which can be managed and it doesn't break the system once a product is upgraded. So you need to make tough decisions around processes, around the product, around people, and around data, because data is a big asset within the organization. How much of data you're taking from the legacy, what is good data looks like, and how many times you're actually taking on ownership of governing and putting some data governance around it. So all those elements need to be factored in as part of governance.
Yeah. I think hearing you speak, it reminds me or triggered a thought that a lot of organizations and teams underestimate how many hard decisions you have to make for a lot of different things. You talk about governance and business processes. You take business processes, for example, just defining what you want your processes to be and what you as an organization want to be when you grow up. That alone entails a lot of tough decisions, because it's inevitable that you're not going to get a unanimous agreement that this is how our process should look. And the leader or leaders within the organization are going to have to make the decision that, yes, this is how we're going to operate. And I know, Lippy, you may not be happy about it, and but this is what we're doing, and this is what it's going to look like, and here's what it means to you, Lippy. And now we talk about how to transition you and why we're doing the process this way. So you want to get as much buy-in as you can, but you're never going to get 100% buy-in, and there's times where you just have to.
You cannot make everyone happy, but you have to make that decision for the greater good in terms of what is the decision that we are going to go ahead with.
Yeah. Yeah. And you just think about even just walking through a basic process workflow, that can lead to a lot of tough decisions. But, what's interesting about this question that Praveen asks is, let's talk about maybe for a second, what happens if you don't make those tough decisions and you sort of just, for a lot of flat organizations that operate as more of a democracy, and they don't want to be they're almost afraid of being top down command control. So a lot of organizations say, well, we're just not going to make those tough decisions, and we're going to let the frontline people sort of define what this is going to look like. What is that? I mean, that can lead to a lot of problems. Maybe, what are some of the things you see, or have you seen that dynamic?
I have seen that if you do not make the tough decision upfront, you are going to leave with those kind of problems later on. You have to make those tough decisions later on, but it's in a much more complex situation where you are making those tough decisions. So it's better to make those tough decisions much earlier on, communicate it clearly, so that you don't actually fall in a path of, making that tough decision later on, where you have already burned the budget, you have already lost the time, and now it's also about, where it is going. So taking a different direction. So it's worth taking those tough decisions up front.
Yeah. Yeah. And you think of the things that come out of not making decisions. For example, customization. A lot of times people blame customization for the failure of their projects. And it could be that the customization has created risks and problems. But if you really dig deep, you find that, well, maybe it was because you didn't make the tough decision that we're not going to customize, or we're going to simplify our process and use the technology a certain way. You didn't make that tough decision. So then you get overpowered by people that don't want to change, or that have a different vision of what they think the process should look like. And so that leads to customization.
Absolutely. Yeah. Other point I was going to touch upon, since you mentioned about it. So if you are in a global rollout, and let's take an example of multiple countries you're rolling out, and if you don't have a streamlined process, and every country might be talking over each other, where you have the politics might be around there, and you have to go by one direction. But how do you maintain with all the kind of nuances within the product to say you're not taking upfront decisions about streamlining the process, which is completely understand, because you might have to go with that, but that means you are spending more supporting the product, which comes later. So whichever way, you have to take the decision, and you have to make that judgment of cost effectiveness, either you're doing it upfront or maybe later supporting the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good, but there's a lot more questions coming in, so I'll take some more audience questions here. Hafid from Oman says the devil is in the details. So that's his commenter's contribution to our conversation.
Yeah.
I totally agree with. And then let's see here. I think this one might be a specific question to Microsoft D365. What is this is from Satnam. I'm not sure where she's from, but Satnam asks, what is your experience around implementing a D365 solution when choosing whether a single instance versus multi-instance model for global transformation? What are the pros and cons of each? It's a great question.
It relates to previously what we were discussing about the processes, whether you're having, the streamlining processes across all the countries, or you're having multiple different kind of variation across different countries. Then single instance, it's also about, how much you deployment, whether you want to go with the deployment of one big bang deployment across all the countries, or you want to take it's a time factor as well. You have to bring that in, whether you want to some countries might not be prepared to go for a one-time global rollout. So then you have to take that into consideration, and then you have to plan that multiple instance versus single instance kind of decision.
Yeah. There's definitely pros and cons to each, and I think with that decision, and actually any of these decisions we've been talking about, it seems like I think people need to recognize that there is no easy answer. A lot of these decisions are going to be more difficult than you think, and even the right answer is going to have problems or potential risks that go along with that. So it's a matter of understanding that there's risk to every decision you make. If you go single instance, there's risk. If you go with multi-instance, there's risk there too. It's just a matter of which risk is more palatable to the organization.
Absolutely. It's measuring the risk again, the time factor against the deployment.
Yeah. Okay, great discussion. Thanks, Lipi. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more discussion. I'm going to ask you some more questions about your book. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Lipi Sarkar, the author of Building a Digital Future, and want to jump back into some more questions I have for you. And then here's an interesting another question from Praveen, and he asks why would any application not be flexible enough to cover business changes? Technology must be changed per the business, not the other way around. So I think it's asking the question of the whole, do we change our business or do we change the technology? Is it both? Yeah. I mean, how do you navigate that decision or that continuum?
It's a great question, Praveen. So yeah, I really like the idea of how much you can bring the balance in between technology and business change. It changes how many people are involved, how many different departments are involved, how many different kind of, the business process changes you are bringing in. So you have to factor that in while you are assessing the impact of change to any organization. Versus technology, if we go by the technology kind of route, that means you are doing to people, you're actually pushing the changes to people. They are not accepting the change. So I think there need to be a balance here sometimes. So with Dynamics 365, with the Microsoft product, we know that sometimes it's quite easy. And if you're into Dynamics, you know that how easily it can work, but it's not and quite intuitive. So that's what the change element need to implement, that it is quite intuitive. You don't have to have a lot of training to actually use the system. With little bit of training, you can go there, but it's also about whether people have been change fatigue or not, with a different kind of other transformation programs running in parallel. So you have to measure all this while measuring the change impact.
Yeah. And again, I think that's a great example of a decision that you need to think carefully through and have full alignment on, because I think that may seem like a small detail that executives and other leaders may want to push down to the project team without having a clear vision. And if you don't have alignment and expectations aren't aligned on what those trade-offs are and what the decision is, then that's where you run into problems later on.
Absolutely.
Maybe as a follow-up question then, and this is my question, just to be candid, I'll try not to hog the questions here, but just as a follow-up, what have you seen work for getting executives aligned, especially if executives think that this is an IT project? So let's just say I'm a CEO and I've got an executive team that says, Lipi's got this under control. I don't care if it's multi-instance or single instance. I don't care if we change, or maybe I might think, well, I'm not going to change the technology, so let's just use vanilla off-the-shelf software and just go figure it out. I mean, how do you help me better understand that there's more to it than that, and there's risks and there's decisions that need to be made? How have you found it to work to engage, key executives and stakeholders in that way?
One is about the steerco meeting, where you have all the board members come together. So it's not just one person against the other person who's actually leading the digital transformation. It's bringing everyone's perspective together. So as a CEO, you might think that everything is under control, but I need to have that kind of relationship with the CEO to have that kind of sensitive information and discuss that this is going maybe pear-shaped. This is something, there are more to it. It's not meeting the eye maybe right now, but I should be able to flag those kind of risks upfront so that have that open discussion rather than leaving it for later or brushing it under the carpet completely. I prefer to have that discussion with that kind of relationship also happening between the executive, the sponsors, and different department, maybe head of, the head of department, head of country, head of national region. but they need to have that kind of synergy, because also sometimes you see that one region might be having very prominent and very upfront with kind of requirements and very vocal about the requirements. The other country might not. But when you're actually doing the change, and if it is similar kind of change and one process, then you're actually delivering the change to everyone, whether they are receptive or they are accepting all those kind of changes. So if there is no synergy, if they are not bought in, if they don't understand the wider aspect, then it is leading to, and it's misleading in that case. So hence, always bring that conversation, even if you think that it is not risky at this point in time, but keeping up to date information of what is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. Well, here's a follow-up question to the single instance issue, and this is from Satnam again. And she asks, have you experienced latency issues, and what's been the approach to resolve it?
That's a little bit technical question for me, so I will dodge it for the time being. But
that's why I was quiet, because I had no idea what to say to that. So I was
yeah.
to answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will leave that for my solution architect team to come back to it. Yeah. But happy to take that question if you need to, have some thoughts and guidance. Happy to come back to you.
Yeah, and this is just so you know, further context of the question. She also asks, have you used third-party applications to improve latency? Can Microsoft use mirroring to alleviate latency where the database servers are located at a distance? And that's way over my head, as far as I'm not an architect at all, so I don't have a good answer for that.
I haven't used third-party for the latency issues. That's quite clear. But there is a penetration testing. Sometimes you need to do those kind of penetration testing where you need to involve the third party. That's what I can say. And there are different kind of, depending on different kind of testing latency issues, they might be able to have that upfront. And if you need to resolve those kind of issues, change your code, you might be able to do that based on the best guidance and practices provided both by those kind of testing that comes out as an outcome.
Right. And I just want to congratulate Satnam, because she is the first person that has stumped both myself and the guest on a question that either one of us. Usually at least one of us could sort of piece together an answer, but that's the first one where I'm at a loss. So thank you, Satnam. Congratulations. You win the challenge of stumping both people on the show here. So another question from Praveen again is, everyone knows what to change or implement. What causes failure during digital journey? I have seen it equally from customer and the SI. So I think the question is, whose fault is it? Maybe that's another way to simplify the question, is whose fault is it when there's failure? Is it the implementing company, or is it the SI or the person, the outside company that's implementing the technology?
That's a great question. And I wish I could dodge this kind of question, because it's quite a tricky question to answer. But to be honest, that's really a great question, because it's nobody's fault, or it's also everybody's fault. Because if you have not discussed about any kind of risk, and if you have not flagged the risk from the SI's perspective, I would say if the SI have not come up with the risk and have discussed about the key risk that might come up in future, then it's SI's fault. But also about if the SI has discussed that no decision has been made and it has been forgotten, then it's also the organization, from the organization point of view, it's the organization's fault. So I'm from my mindset, I would say, and that's what the book is also talking about. It's not about fault. We are not in the blame game culture. It's more about talk about those kind of issues openly and try to mitigate this risk much upfront. And even if some issues, some risk will still be unknown. If it is an unknown, have that kind of open culture. Empower people to talk about that openly, and to have some mitigation in place whenever you find this, whenever you think that this risk has come up or this issue has come up. So, and we should be going away from this. I have seen this, and it's no fault of, but I've seen this kind of culture sometimes happens when people are saying, oh, this is a SI's fault. And as I would say, okay, we have discussed about this, but I think we should be equally taking that, responsibility, that what we have discussed, and document all this kind of decisions that has been made, so that we can look forward for it, moving away from it. Continuous improvement will not happen if we try to, be in our box and say that it's not my responsibility. It's your responsibility, and, keep on bashing each other, really.
Yeah. I've been involved in a lot of expert witness cases, lawsuits where they hire us to be an expert witness to testify, what went wrong. And it's fascinating how, first of all, how much finger pointing can happen in these projects. It's easy to point fingers at your SI or your SI to point fingers at you, the organization. But I think at the end of the day, if I had to simplify it, I'd say that if you're part of an internal project team that's implementing or, managing this transformation, just remember it's your project. I mean, you have to own it. Even if your SI is giving you advice, sometimes you don't always have to listen to the SI. I mean, there's a fine line between taking the advice of people that have done this before, but also recognizing it's your business and you have to live with the consequences of whatever it is. So whatever you need to do to be successful, do it. And it may or may not align with what the SI wants you to do. And it's easier said than done, because if you haven't been through this before, you don't necessarily know. But the last thing you want to do is just completely outsource it and say, okay, my SI is going to take care of this for me. They're the experts. Yeah. I'm not going to get too involved. That's the worst thing you can do. So I think the key advice I would give is just to take ownership.
Totally agree. Yeah.
So just to summarize, if just to wrap up the conversation, if I'm about to start a transformation or I'm in the early stages of this transformation, what 3 pieces of advice would you give to me? What 3 things should I do to make sure that I set myself up for success to the best of my ability?
If you're starting a digital transformation and if you have already identified what are the business case, what are the key drivers of change, then I think you have already done the first exercise of identifying the key change. Then it's more about identifying the delivery partner who can work with you, but who can also gel with the culture of the organization. So just have this conversation and see who is the best in the industry or who has worked with the past recommendations and worked in similar kind of time frame. And think about the time frame. Are you too focused about the time frame that these are the benefits that you need to deliver within the organization, or it's more about you have to think about a perspective of change, how many change you can bring in during this time frame? Are you flexible about it? Don't go by milestone driven, go by how much of change you are actually delivering to your own organization. And how can you measure that? Because with all going on with the pandemic and life has taken a completely different direction. Yes, we are very demanding. In our day-to-day life, we are using apps and everything. So we are demanding. The customers have become very demanding. So in terms of bringing all this experience together, so think about how much of change your organization can sustain. So not to think about, yes, it's a one-time project, let me bring it in, let me bring one SI and try to build it all together and deliver it in maybe a year, maybe 9 months. But is your organization prepared for that? So prepare your organization, understand, identify, assess, and to measure the key internal strengths and capability and see how much you can sustain and what you can go for.
Yeah, that's good closing advice. So if I didn't already have a copy of this book, and I'm trying to show the audience what it looks like. I really like this cover, by the way. I don't know why. That's super cool, the cover there. I had the good fortune of you all providing me a complimentary copy, so I appreciate that. But I didn't buy it. Where can I find this book if I don't already have a copy?
You can find that in Amazon Marketplace. You can also buy that from Wiley. So online, you can just get it. So Eric, if you can share the link, I can provide you the link, and you can share the link through this. So that's okay. Good.
Perfect. Be happy to do that. Well, thank you for being here, Lipi. Really appreciate your time and loved having you on the show. And it's a great book. I appreciate the fact that you're doing that. You and Vinny wrote that book, and again, it's so relevant to. There are some Microsoft specific things in it, but 95% of it, I'd say, is totally relevant, regardless of what technology you're implementing.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's my pleasure to talk to you, Eric. And it's not a technical book. It's more written from the aspiration that we can help the community. We can help anyone who doesn't have, who is enrolling on digital transformation journey. And also the aspiration is for future students who has not got any experience of digital transformation or even the technology, at least they get some great insight from the book. And we would like to stay current with the book. So talking in conversation with you, Eric, and also to, if we can respond to any kind of question that comes through. So great questions. Thank you, everyone, for asking those questions.
Well, thank you, Lipi. That was a great conversation. A lot of good stuff there. A lot of good stuff that we could have covered, didn't have time to in today's conversation, but that was a good overview. And actually, when we come back from a quick break, Paresa, Kyler, and I are going to talk more about some of the topics that we covered here in that discussion, as well as some of the other topics that she has in her book. So we're going to further unpack and dive into the book when we come back from a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. You can find us every Wednesday, new episodes on YouTube, as well as the audio platforms for podcast, Apple, Google, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, all that good stuff. Find us every Wednesday with new episodes. So the discussion we just had with Lipi and the book, Building a Digital Future, what are your guys' thoughts? We covered a lot of stuff there, and it was a pretty broad discussion, but what are some of your observations or questions coming out of that?
She seems amazing. I mean, just her perspective on all things, really all things digital transformation. Like you said, this book is applicable to everything. It's not just software oriented, right? It's not just, focused on Microsoft, but it applies across the board. So it's interesting to hear where all of her findings are rooted in. You guys talked about it a little bit on, where did she get her inspiration from the book? Is it based on, common practices she sees people implement, or is it based on qualitative data, based on her experience? So I thought that was really interesting just because, writing a book and consulting, there's a lot of overlap there. So I was curious, Eric, on both your consulting style and really just the consulting style of Third Stage as a whole. And kind of, I want to go on this tangent to just explore that for a second, because I'm curious on what Third Stage's consulting and, advising of clients is rooted in. Where do you get your best practices from, and how do you guide your clients when you're sitting at the table with them?
Sure. It's a great question. So, over the years, first of all, we've done a lot of research on ERP implementations, and, dating back to my previous company, we had done annual studies that would quantitatively look at, how long implementations were taking and how much they were costing and what some of the common challenges were that CIOs and project teams were facing during those implementations. So a lot of it is grounded in that research that we were doing. And it's also based on our implementation experience. And a lot of people out there have implementation experience, so we're not unique in that way. But where we're unique is that we have implementation experience as independent implementation partners. So it may sound like like we're splitting hairs, but it's actually a really big deal because we look at it not from a technology first perspective, but more from a business first perspective, more of an agnostic perspective. And those are two very different approaches. And when you come at it from a more agnostic approach or perspective, you tend to see things more clearly, and you tend to see viable alternatives outside the realm of what you might be thinking, if you're thinking inside the box of one technology. So, for example, if I were a system integrator or a VAR or reseller of ERP software, and I was hired to implement for you, for any organization, my job is to push as much of my software into your organization as I can. And you're not going to get a clear read on where, what the pros and cons of that are, or, if that's the right answer or not, if you're just thinking of that one option. So coming at it from the independent perspective allows us to sort of see the warts and the dark side and be able to objectively call out those challenges and problems. So a lot of it is that experience as well. And then the third data point we have for experience, in addition to the research, the implementation experience on the agnostic side, the third area is our expert witness experience. So we are hired quite oftenly for expert witness projects, which, for those of you that don't know, that entails expert witness work entails a lawsuit in court. So there's some sort of lawsuit involving ERP or digital transformation technologies. They'll hire us to come in and provide an independent assessment of what happened, why did the project fail, what were all the different factors at play, and all that stuff. So seeing those extreme examples of train wrecks and disasters in the industry has really shown us what some of those best practices are of what not to do. And then certainly, on the side of our more successful clients, we have plenty of examples of what you should do and what the contrast between those two things are. So those are really the three primary, inputs into what we consider best practice and how we advise our clients. And I think there was a second part to your question, but now I forgot what it was.
Well, yeah, no, that takes me to the next thing I was going to ask you is for other consultants. I mean, I'm sure we have a handful of consultants listening right now, right? So I'm curious, what would you advise them to base their advice on? Because it's interesting, any mentor or coach or consultant, they all have a different approach, and it's all based on a different foundation, right? And all of it really comes back to experience, but it's, how do you fine tune it and see, what your angle is when you approach the table to guide somebody, right? So I guess my next question was, what would you advise other consultants to teach on and find their story to share with their clients?
Yeah, that's a tough question because, I worked for one of the big system integrators early in my career, and most consultants, I think, are probably working for a firm that is somehow aligned with a software vendor or a specific technology. So it's easier. So it's easy for me to say, because we're independent, I'll tell you what I think you should do. But the reality of whether or not you can actually do that working for the man, if you will, is a totally different story. I mean, I guess I know this isn't answering your question, but what I can tell you is my experience working with the big firm I worked with early in my career. Our job was to push SAP. That I worked for. I was part of an organization that worked very closely with the SAP practice, and our job was to either recommend clients shift to SAP, or in the cases where they had already selected SAP, our job was to come in and do the change management for it. So it was sort of a twofold purpose we had. But when I was there, I remember, especially when we were doing software evaluations, I remember feeling like it was just wrong what we were doing. I mean, because we were billing a lot of money to tell clients the answer we already knew the answer to, and it didn't matter what the right answer was. We had the answer. It was SAP. That was the answer. And so it wasn't a matter of, is that the answer? It's, how are we going to justify that answer? So, yeah, I mean, I would ask, what at the time might have seemed to others within the organization like a stupid question of, like, why aren't we considering other systems besides SAP? Or is SAP really the best fit for this client? I couldn't really ask those kind of questions without getting very strange looks, and I quickly learned, don't ask that question. That's not at all what you should be worried about. So, I can tell you that you should do that, but I learned from my own experience and having been there that you can't really do that. You're sort of shackled by, you're tethered by the realities of the organization you work for. What I'd say, if you're an independent consultant, you're not tethered by that, which there's not many people out there that are truly agnostic or independent. But if you are, then I'd say, don't be blinded by optimism. Don't assume that everything's going to be great and that all the assumptions in your business case are going to come to fruition easily. I mean, there's a lot of pains that go along with it. There's a lot of downside risk. You've got to look at the dark side as well and mitigate those. It's when you stick your head in the sand and think that there's no risk or there's no downside, or you're not considering alternate options, that's where companies get into trouble. So I think that'd be the biggest thing I'd say, is just really keep an open mind and be open to multiple paths or possible paths, and objectively compare those paths to one another.
That's great advice. And that applies to whether you're a consultant or you're just going through a transformation. I mean, explore all options. Don't leave anything off the table, right? And you also mentioned that one of the basis of your, guidance to clients is sitting on, those cases where you're exploring those massive failures. And that's something that Lipi was talking about as well, when you guys kind of got into the conversation of what are some of the key causes of ERP failure. And one of the biggest things that she mentioned that stood out to me was fear of change. And we always go back to this. It's organizational change management, right? So anybody who's anybody kind of gets a little bit freaked out when you start talking about change. And when it's change related to how your day-to-day operations are going to go as an employee, if it's change to, am I possibly going to lose my job? The fear is, it makes sense and it's understandable, right? And it goes back to that conversation about resistance. So my question to you, and I mean, Kyler, you could probably speak to this as well, but how do you manage that fear? How can you, kind of bring comfort to people as you walk into a digital transformation to help ease that resistance?
Well, I think first of all, the more communication, the better. I mean, the more you can communicate and be transparent, that alone will alleviate fear, even if there's messaging that employees don't want to hear. It's better than no communication at all. And I think a lot of times organizations are afraid themselves because they don't know that they don't have all the answers, and they want to wait until they have all the answers before they communicate, specifics to employees. And that's where, it's, even though the intention is good, it leads to some unintentional consequences when you do that. So I think being transparent and communicating as much as you can, and really just involving people through the journey. If you can involve key stakeholders or key team members within all the different departments and locations, within your organization, that's ideal. Now it's easier said than done because you still have a business to run and you don't want to pull away too many people for too long for this project. But you have to find that right balance where you do have heavy involvement, and it might be more painful than you want to pull them out of their day-to-day operations. But if you really want this project to be successful and you're serious about it, then you need to find a way to backfill them or give them the support they need to be able to support the project in the way that they should, and in which case they're going to be more a part of the journey and they're going to own it, and then they can take that back to their local teams or their different departments or whatever. So those are probably the two biggest ways. And then maybe a third one would be just making sure that the executive team and the project team are aligned on the direction they're going and what the overall strategy is. If you do that, that's going to help alleviate or neutralize a lot of the headwinds that a lot of organizations face. When you're not aligned, that just creates a lot of chaos and confusion, which then leads to fear and doubt and that sort of thing. So those are just a few things that I'd focus on, at least at a high level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to just build on that, I know in the book and in the session, Lipi touched on the true role of executive leadership when it comes to digital transformation. And it definitely sparked a trend. As Eric, I know you released a blog on Wednesday talking about the role of a digital transformation leader. When it comes to change, being involved, and you kind of just touched on this earlier, having that balance of letting your team have the autonomy, but still being aware of what's going on and not being blinded by the optimism of the project manager to say this is all going great, and hopefully it is going great, right? But understanding what potential risks and being able to be aware and identify those risks trickle down to that conversation of change, and making sure that you're keeping a pulse on the organization as an executive leader. A lot of times there's that bubble, right? That's not rising to you, or that feedback isn't rising. So the importance of acknowledging that that's a huge part of your role as an executive sponsor, or the overall alignment piece, but also making sure that you're still very much aware of what's going on within the change conversation. Because that's what oftentimes I've learned from Lipi and you, Eric, is where that resistance kind of harbors, and then it becomes too late to really address it because the business is completely disrupted at that point. So I learned specifically from that blog and Lipi that that's a key skill set of the executive on the actual project and the senior management of the business.
Yeah, there's so much there that leaders and executives need to do that I don't think they're necessarily prepared for in most cases. Decision making and explaining the decisions that you've made, and recognizing that not everyone's going to be happy with that decision, and aligning those decisions with the overall company strategy and communicating them. I mean, all that stuff takes time, and a lot of executives think of this as this is just an IT project or a technology initiative, and it really isn't. It is a true business transformation in most cases if you're doing it right. If you're just simply doing an upgrade and you want to keep your processes the way they are and you're not really looking for any meaningful change to your business, that's not terrible. That's not the end of the world. That's okay for some organizations. But if you're not one of those organizations, you really are trying to improve your business and take it to the next level as part of the transformation, then those are the types of decisions you have to make. And one thing I want to do, I know you've got more questions, Paresa, so let's take a quick break and we'll dive into this a bit more because I know we've got a lot to unpack with this whole discussion. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more discussion about the book and some of the topics within it when we come back from more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. We are in the middle of a heated, dramatic conversation about the book that we are talking about, and I'm exaggerating quite a bit when I say heated and dramatic, but we are having a good conversation about some of the topics in building a digital future, which was our guest earlier in the episode. And right before the break, we were talking about change management leadership and how that plays into alleviating fear. So, Paresa, I don't know if does that answer your question, or do you have follow-ups from that thread, or have additional questions?
Well, it definitely answers my question, so thank you. But it did spark another question just around executive sponsors. So, obviously in IT transformation, you look to the CIO. But when you're talking about executive sponsors, I mean, would it be a best practice or a recommendation to reach to maybe the CFO, reach to a different executive? It's obviously going to be more of an appealing reach to the CFO if you're transforming how your accounting and finance team runs, obviously, right? But what if it's just an overarching ERP system? I mean, do you really need the CIO to be the eyes on it, or would you benefit more having kind of that cross-departmental collaboration?
Yeah, I think definitely the cross-departmental collaboration is what you want. How to get there, more commonly we see that someone other than the CIO being that executive sponsor and sort of the face at the executive level for the transformation is more effective in accomplishing that. And a lot of that is perception, because it's just a perception thing. If your CIO is the executive sponsor, that people perceive that a lot differently than if your CFO or your COO are the executive sponsor. If it's a CFO or COO, that signals to me, if I'm an employee, that signals to me that this is them leading it from a business perspective. If it's a CIO, I think, oh, okay, this is like an IT thing. May or may not be reality, but that's the way the average employee is going to perceive it. The only caveat to that I'd say is, some of the more effective CIOs that I've worked with in my career are the ones that actually have worked in operations. So they have a bit more credibility than the average CIO, because they understand how different parts of the business work. And if people recognize that about a CIO, then I think it's okay to have the CIO in that role. But you still have somewhat of a perception issue, but it's not as bad, if you have a CIO who has that background. But I think more importantly, I think even beyond the perception, if you go a level deeper, when you have the business or someone from the business sponsoring it, it just changes the mindset of the entire team and the entire program. It becomes more focused on how are we going to make our business better, and how are we going to organize our team, and by the way, how are we going to fit technology within that? But the priorities tend to shift a bit when you've got a different executive sponsor like that. So that's generally what we recommend, which can be difficult, which I fully acknowledge, because a lot of times the CIO is the one that drives or spearheads these projects, or brings it to the table, or convinces the executive team that they need to automate or digitize their business or whatever. And so it can be hard to hand that off. And not to say the CIO shouldn't be involved; they should be extremely involved for sure. But as far as who the executive sponsor is and who the tiebreaker is, or the ultimate decision maker, having the business on that side can be highly effective.
That opens the door to the steering committee, right? The executive sponsor is super important, but maybe having that diversity on the steering committee is that piece in which bringing the whole business transformation. So we're making sure we're talking to sales, we're talking to marketing, we're talking to business operations, and having all of those decision makers there. I think a lot of times what I learned from third stage projects is it's really unique to the business and their overall organizational structure, but just making sure we have those conversations of just the overall access and engagement of that executive is really more important than what is his or her C-suite title, and how do they interact with that core team.
Yeah, it's a great point. That I'm glad you clarified that, because it's not, it's not just executive sponsor. Obviously, that's one layer, but then who's on the steering committee? That's equally important. Just to make sure you've got that cross-functional representation, regardless of who your executive sponsor is. So, really,
and that sets the tone for that such important message that this is a business transformation. We will go through this as an organization, as a community. It's not siloed to one department.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and going back to the original question before we went to break around, fear of change, that perception piece that you guys are talking about would probably play a huge role in how kindly people take to the change. I mean, if they perceive it, like you said, as a business transformation rather than just an IT transformation, they'll be more inclined to follow. But then also you think about it from just who is delivering the message. If it comes from someone they like, trust, and respect on their team, when it trickles down, they're probably going to be more acclimated to, accept the change. So perception plays a huge role, and it's kind of those intangible aspects of, almost like human psychology that'll help you get you across the finish line.
Yeah, you need a change management therapist, right? Involved.
That's right. So let's transition to my next question. I want to talk about benefits realization, because you and Lipi discussed this really to the extent of, what are you missing at Go Live if you don't fine tune the operation and fine tune the program, right? So my question to you is, a lot of people are really focused on the project. That's what you guys were talking about. They're focused on getting to the finish line. Let's complete the project, go back to our regular job, right? But they don't take the time to fine tune once they hit Go Live. So what should they fine tune? I mean, once you get to the finish line, where can people focus on to make sure that they're really optimizing the new technology?
Yeah, well, I guess the first part, to answer the first part of your question, or what's embedded in your question, is, what is the finish line? Is the finish line Go Live, or is the finish line to create business value and to improve the business? And those are two very different finish lines. And I would maybe ask a third question of, is there even a finish line? Should there be a finish line? I mean, as much as people hate to hear that, because you just want to be done and, like you said, get on with your lives and, forget the headaches and the chaos that went along with your transformation, you miss so much value. You spent all this time and money on the project, and now you're just going to stop. And it just seems odd, because there's in the grand scheme of things, you spent this much time and money on a project. If you spent this much extra time and money, you would get so much value. And to me, that's the highest value part of the entire project, is all the optimization you do afterwards. And so you have to look at all the things that, more of an iterative process, all the things that don't happen in the first iteration of your first Go Live, or, day one of Go Live. All the not just the confusion, but the the processes that aren't working quite the way you thought they would, or the people that don't quite understand how to use the technology the way they should. So you've got to do refresher training, or the data that's getting corrupted because people don't understand the new data structure, and so now the data is getting messed up, which is creating problems downstream. So you look at all these little things that are like little paper cuts, but then they add up to a bunch of lost value. And in some cases, you see a lot of companies that have so many paper cuts after the Go Live that they actually are seeing less value, or less productivity, or less efficiency and effectiveness than they did before they went live. So that's sort of what you're up against. So you've got to really look at where's that finish line, and what does that phase after Go Live look like, and how are we going to staff it and allocate resources to it, just as we would all the stuff leading up to Go Live. And the problem is, so many companies are in such a rush to move on to the next phase of the project, or if that was it, that was the Go Live, like you mentioned, Paresa, they want to go back to their day jobs and call it good. So that's the dynamic you have to face. But as an executive or leader, you have to look at that and say, okay, maybe we spent whatever the number is, we might have spent $1 million on this transformation, or 10 million, whatever the number is. Why not spend an extra 5% of the time and effort and money that we just spent on the whole implementation just to get it right and really maximize and crank up that value?
Right. And you mentioned rushing to the next phase. And I mean, that kind of goes back to our conversation about ERP failure, because I guess from what I've learned from you and from just everything that we're putting out, it's success comes when you are in budget and on time for the most part. So then when people are going through their transformation and they're rushing to that next phase in an effort to stay on the timeline, I mean, they could overlook things that they should be focusing on, right? And ultimately it would come back to, bite them in the butt a little bit. So I guess what's the trade-off there? Is there more value in making sure that you stay on your timeline and stay within budget? Or, I mean, like you just said, is it worth, kind of going that extra 5%, going that extra mile? You've already come this far. You might as well crank it up and maximize what you've been doing. Trade-offs.
Yeah, that's a great balancing question, and it's, there's not a science to it, but you do have to find that balance. Yeah. I mean, companies get so focused on just those metrics of go live on time, on budget, and they're so proud of it when they hit it. But you really have to look at the longer term total cost and total benefit, not just what leads up to go live. Now, the risk here is that you actually have a lot more to lose by not doing the things you should be doing and potentially risking going over budget or going over time. That risk is actually a lot lower than the impact that it could have to your business after. I remember it was just a couple years after I'd started my last company. It was our first big implementation that we had managed as a team, together as a team. And the client the client had a bunch of customization for the software they implemented. There's a bunch of stuff they wanted to change. I won't get into whether that was the right answer or not, or whether they should have or not, but they did. They did a bunch of customization, which caused delays in the project. And there's already, I think, 2 delays leading up to this point, and we had recommended, because we were the PMO and we were doing the change management and the program management, and we had suggested to them that we push it out 30 days because there was still risk percolating that we hadn't fully addressed. And the CEO said, no, we've already had 2 delays. We're not delaying again. And it would have cost, if I remember right, it was like $60,000 or something. It's a mid-sized manufacturing company, so they weren't huge, but it was going to be about $60,000 more in 30 days longer in the project. And he said, nope, we're done. I've already overspent and did the time. And then when we went live, the company lost. And when I say lost, I don't mean deferred or delayed or whatever. I mean, they actually lost $10 million in sales. So, which equated to, somewhere between $1 and $2 million of profit. So, in exchange for saving the $60,000, they lost $1 to $2 million of profit. And those sales never came back because they were sales that they couldn't ship and deliver because the system wasn't working the way it should. They couldn't ship and deliver on time, so the customers canceled the orders and went with a competitor. So that's the sort of cost benefit you have to look at, and it's amazing how few people look past that finish line, as you call it, Paresa. They don't look at what's it going to look like on the other side, because the last thing you want to do is say, "Yay, congratulations, we came in on time, on budget, but we destroyed the entire business and brought it to its knees." That's not what anyone wants to see happen. So
yeah, definitely, and that's where those project health checks, right, that we've talked about on here, and we on our other podcast a few weeks ago, digital transformation podcast, we talked about what a project health check looks like. So that way you can kind of take a break and say, where are we at? And this is the risks of kind of pushing through that intangible finish line, or making sure that we're going back to our strategic goals, which is to increase sales, or build value of companies, or acquire other companies, whatever that looked like. But I also wanted to touch just briefly, Paresa, on the other piece of that question when it came to business processes and operations, and making sure that you really go through that process too, because of course the finish line is important, but as Lipi said and Eric said in the interview, really building and owning what your future state looks like for business processes too is so important. I think something that a lot of our clients and partners don't realize is that can be kind of passed off to a system integrator or a VAR and saying kind of like that's off our list and we don't we don't own that. And I think it's an important point to pull out how that can be misleading to get to that finish line and how important it is to own that process within your business internally. And I think, Eric, you'd probably agree with that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Because your technical implementer, whether it's a system integrator or VAR, or whoever the vendor is that's doing the technical implementation, they're looking at the future state from the perspective of how do I build the software? Like, what do I need to know to design and build the software? And that's totally different than what is my end-to-end business process flow going to look like. I'm not, your business is not individual pieces of technical workflows and technical configurations, but that's what a technical implementer does. So the job of the business is to pull those pieces together, and as well as other pieces that have nothing to do with the technology. So the people and process side of it, and maybe there's other technologies outside of your core technology that you need to tie together as well, like, within the architecture of it. So yeah, I totally agree. You've got to understand that difference and that delta between what a technical system integrator is going to do versus what you need as a business.
Yeah, definitely. And if our audience is interested in more information, our Digital Transformation podcast features Dave Beldick, who is an operations specialist. Many people saw him at Digital Stratosphere. He's a genius when it comes to how can you optimize that before your implementation. So definitely go check that out. As Paresa, I think that's such an important question that a lot of times businesses don't think about or consider when it comes to that timeline and kind of pushing through. Like, we pass this off, delegated to someone else. Delegation is important, right? But it's still so important to make sure that you're continuing to align with your goals as a business, not a different partner's goals, or letting the technology lead to say it can do this function and you do this function. So we have to change our business to do function A and function B. That's not how that should work, right? We should say we want to be able to do this thing and let the technology join in that strategy, not lead it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well said.
It's your project, right? You got to own it.
Yeah.
If you want it to end up how you envision it ending up. So,
yeah.
Great point. I also want to touch on drivers of change, because you and Lipi talked about this very extensively, I'd say, is what is the catalyst to pushing companies to adopt a new technology? And I actually think this was a question from the audience that came in, is how do you know when you're ready for change? Or, what are the red flags that'll stand out and start waving when it's time for you to really look at your technology and your processes, like you just said, Kyler? So maybe I know that there's a lot of red flags that could pop up, right? But at a high level, is it, our sales are down, or there's a kink in our process, or, what are some high level flags that you've seen companies come across that kind of sparks that idea of, hey, we'd probably benefit from updating our technology?
Yeah, anytime you find that you have a high degree of manual processes or dual processes, that's usually a pretty big red flag, and every organization has that. It's just, how much of that are they willing to tolerate, the inefficiencies and the manual processes and whatnot. So that's one red flag. Another one is if you haven't updated or upgraded your system in years, chances are you should either think about upgrading that system or look at new potential technology that might help get you more cutting edge technology that can help improve and automate your business. And then the other one, that's probably the more obvious and unfortunate one, is when a vendor tells you they're going to stop supporting their system, which a lot of vendors are doing that as we speak. So they're giving you some lead time that says you've got 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or whatever to get off our system, and then we're going to stop supporting it, and you're going to have to either upgrade to our new system or go find a different vendor. So those are some of the biggest ones that we see.
Right. Gosh, that third one, your back's up against the wall at that point.
It's like a
that
breakup,
one irritates me.
A bad breakup.
Yeah,
with an abusive partner that is going to
Unhealthy
force you to stay together.
Yeah.
Oh, that is so funny. There was something with JD Edwards, right? I mean, are they they pivoting away from supporting their platform? I remember us talking about this.
Yes, I believe so. I can't remember the year, but I think they have a year. I think they have a roadmap through 2030, if I remember correctly, for JD Edwards, that they'll support it. But still, you still have to look at that and say, okay, great, you'll support it, but are you really going to put R&D into it? Is it really going to evolve? Am I going to get machine learning and AI and analytics and all the stuff that, Oracle's other products are going to absolutely get, like Oracle Fusion, Cloud ERP, or whatever they're calling it now. So those are some things you have to think about.
Right. Well, interesting. And this kind of takes me back to our beginning segment about Windows 365 rolling out, because their whole purpose of rolling out Windows 365 is to help with, when you have multiple PCs, multiple employees from all over the world that are going to take their PCs to the cloud, right? So this takes me to my next question, is another question that was from the audience. Choosing a software for single instance versus multi-instance models for transformation. And keep me honest here, Eric, but I assume single instance versus multi-instance is like a one-time global rollout versus multiple rollouts. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's an instance is sort of like imagine it is like not a different version, but it's a different setup of the software. So like a lot of times companies will say, North America, we're going to have an instance for North America, and then we're going to have an instance for Europe because there's different processes there, different regulations, and we just want to set up a whole different instance there. So that's probably the simplest way. It's an oversimplification, but probably the simplest way that I can think of to describe it.
No, that helps. Thank you. So it took me to the question of, are there softwares that are more suited for a single instance rollout versus a multi-instance rollout?
Yeah. So when you look at software as a service, so the NetSuites of the world, Workday, Salesforce, any sort of SaaS product, that's a multi-tenant. I don't want to blur the lines too much though, but that's multi-tenant, and there really is sort of one instance. You're not setting up a whole new customization or a fully customized version or setup of that software for your organization. You're using the same software that everyone else using the software is. So that's sort of one where you're not going to get a multi-instance option, within that model. But when you look at a product like SAP or even Oracle Cloud ERP, those are two examples of on-prem, or historically they were on-premise systems. They're moving to the cloud, but they have a hybrid model too, to where you can do cloud and on-prem, and you can also do multi-instance within those models. So I'd say if you want multi-instance, stay away from the SaaS solutions and look at more of the hybrid cloud solutions. That's going to be your better bet for multi-instance.
Interesting. Okay, that's good feedback. And I'm thinking with Windows 365, I want to say it's just applicable to their Microsoft products, but when you look at Azure, right? I'm saying it right, Azure.
I think so. Yeah, that's the way I say it.
Yeah, it sounds like, based on what you just said, would Azure be more fitting for those multi-instance models?
Yes, it could be. I mean, you could use Azure as a way to set up multiple instances in the cloud, but you could also use Amazon, AWS, or other options out there. And like last week we had Brad from Estes Group talking about his company that they're sort of a middle tier hosting and managed services provider. So there's other options like them that, in addition to the huge, massive players like Amazon and Microsoft.
Right. Almost that boutique service rather than the, Applebee's. Just kidding. They're
right.
better.
The Applebee's of cloud.
The Applebee's of cloud. That's so interesting. I feel like I'm just a sponge learning about the cloud, and it's, now or never really, because the world is just trending toward all things cloud. So, it's interesting to see what Microsoft is doing. It's interesting to see what all the other companies out there are doing, and really how the digital transformation industry is being affected by those changes.
Yeah. And I think that's the great part about this book, is it's like almost a walk before you run. Like, it's very easy to go into these conversations and say, like, we do AI, we have all these machine learnings, go into these software demos and leave like, I am, I'm like a transformer in here type of thing. But this book really kind of backs it up to saying, like, these are the principles that you should remember when it comes to any sort of transformation. So definitely recommend reading it and just going chapter to chapter, because it really does provide a roadmap. And then going to see, if these cloud systems, if these multi-tenant hosting systems, if all of these different options are right for you. But first you have to know, what are you doing, right? And what's your goals, and who's going to continue to get there before you're even ready to enter kind of the cloud conversation. And that's what I like about this book, is it kind of backs up, like, okay, how do you create that strategy?
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. There needs to be more books like that out there.
Yeah, we need a book club. Sure. I think we need a book club, guys.
I think so.
Let's do it.
Yeah,
that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, thanks for those great questions and additional insights into the book and into the threads and the topics that we covered with Lipi. And thanks to everyone for listening here today. Again, you can find us every Wednesday morning with new episodes on YouTube, Google, Amazon, Spotify, Pandora, etc. So be sure to check us out every Wednesday, share it with a friend, and let us know what you think of the show. We'd love to hear your feedback. So want to thank you all. Thanks, Kyler and Paresa, for being here. And we will see you all next week on Transformation Ground Control. Take care.